week 6 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few quarterbacks I would bench this week. The first guy's Kirk Cousins of the Minnesota Vikings. So Cousins last week and the week before that, in week 4 versus Cleveland, he didn't do anything. His Cousins, 203 passing yards, a touchdown, and last week in a good matchup versus the Detroit Lions, 275 and a touchdown and an into. So right here, he's not getting the multiple touchdowns the last few weeks. And in my opinion, he's got a pretty tough matchup at the Carolina Panthers. I give up the 12th least amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks this season. So right now, Kirk Cousins and Adam Thielen once again aren't on the same page. And right now, it's been just Kirk Cousins targeting Justin Jefferson for the most part here the last couple games. Dalvin Cook, who knows if he's going to play in this one, even though Alexander Madison played a good ball game in last week's game. But right here, I can't trust Cousins after what he did the last 2 weeks. And the Panthers at home, they're pretty good defense. So right here, I would bench Cousins. The next quarterback I would bench this week's Derrick Carr of the Las Vegas Raiders. So John Gruden, I know he's out of town, but Gruden, he had a lot of high hopes, and he believed in Derrick Carr the last couple seasons that he was there. But Carr, I mentioned as a drop candidate this week here, but so far he's only been dropped in 6% of fantasy leagues over the last couple days, and he's still owned in 57% of fantasy leagues. But the last 2 games for Carr have been real struggles. Week 4 at the Chargers, 196 passing yards, 2 touchdowns and an into. And week 5 versus a bad team at home in Vegas, he should have took advantage of that defense, especially on his home turf, and he just couldn't get the job done with 206 passing yards and an into. And now here in week 6 at Denver, a tough defense that gives up the second least amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks. I just can't see Carr getting anything done in this ball game or producing a big number. He probably could get 15 to 20 fantasy points, but in my opinion, there's better options out there. So I would bench Carr this week. And the third and final quarterback I would bench this week, Sam Darnold, the Carolina Panthers. So last week versus a weak Philadelphia Eagle team, the 7th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. He mightily struggled, Sam Darnold. 177 passing yards, a touchdown, 3 interceptions, and only 10 rushing yards. So we know Sam Darnold this season, he's been on fire the first month of the season. But in week 5, he came back down to earth a little, and the schedule's getting a little tougher for him this week here with Minnesota. Minnesota gives up the 9th least amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks. And right here, Sam Darnold, he's only 58% of fantasy leagues. But this week, I think this ball game versus Minnesota is going to be a defensive battle. And the last couple Minnesota Viking games, we've seen low-scoring games with their defense doing pretty well. But if Christian McCaffrey comes back, that'll definitely help, obviously, Sam Darnold. But this week, I just can't trust him after last week's poor performance. And the first 3-4 games of the season, he versed pretty easy defenses. So this week, it's another tough matchup, and I would bench him. So that's a few quarterbacks I'll bench in week 6 of the fantasy football season.